Today we have on the agenda variant curation Q&A. I know that you had one slide, Kaizong, for announcements. Did you want to pull that up?
Can everyone see the slide?
Yep.
Yeah, so today we have the variant curation Q&A with the variant curation working group, where we'll be addressing questions on variant curation. And for announcements, next week, our next meeting is on Thursday, September 28th at 12 p.m. ET, and we're going to have a same Q&A session for gene curation. And that's it. I'll hand it over to you, Marina.
Great, thanks, Kaizong. And after this call, we will likely reopen the gene curation survey, just in case you're inspired by the really good questions that we got during this variant curation survey and want to fill that out again. Okay, I'm going to share my screen briefly to give an overview of what's going on with the call. Kaizong, I think you're going to have to make me a host. Or give me sharing permissions. Okay.
Yeah.
Now it says host disabled participants screen sharing. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay. So for the agenda today, we're lucky to have Stephen Harrison with us, who will give us a brief update on the new updated guidelines from ACMG, AMP, ClinGen, and CAP, and the policies related to these new guidelines. And we'll likely encourage you to attend his workshop with Les Biesecker on Friday. And then we will go to a presentation of pre-asked questions from the variant curation core group, and then some live Q&A. And we'll also open it up for questions in between each kind of predetermined theme that we have based on the presentation of the pre-asked questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Harrison, who can briefly introduce himself.
Oh, let's see. I think I need that. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. Let's overwrite that.
I think you should be able to share.
It's working out. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So hopefully you're seeing the right screen here. Oh.
Yep.
And of course, it's doing this thing. All right, there we go. Now it's all the right ones. So welcome, hello everyone. So I'm Stephen Harrison, presenting this on behalf of also Les Biesecker as the co-chair for our ACMG, AMP, CAP, ClinGen working group, and then also our entire working group as well. So I was going to give kind of a briefish idea as to where we are with the guidelines, and then a little bit about what will be coming, hopefully in the somewhat near future, and kind of the impact that it would have on expert panels and also laboratories as well. So yes, as Marina had mentioned, this Friday is we're the last of the ClinGen summer workshops, and we're doing an overview of the guidelines. So if you call into both, a lot of these first slides will be identical to both, but also be able to go into more detail on this one. So if you would like to join on Friday, here is the information. And here's our work group. So this next version is ACMG, AMP, CAP, and ClinGen, and we have work group members from clinical labs, academic, MD, clinician, geneticist, laboratory geneticist. So try to have a good group of people with different backgrounds and expertise to be able to, give their input into this work that we've been doing. So a little bit of background. So I'm sure everyone on this call is, familiar with Richards et al., the 2015 guideline. But before that, there also were two other versions of sequence variant classification guidelines from ACMG, one in 2008 and one in 2002. So ACMG did not version these, but we have decided now to retrospectively call those versions 3, 2, and 1, so that our next version coming out will be version 4.0. And this will allow us better when people are talking about ACMG guidelines and what they're using to be able to say what version of guidelines they're using. Additionally, by doing this versioning, we'll be able to do smaller updates. If there's like sort of a segment that we want to update in the future without revisiting the whole thing, we can, go to 4.1, 4.2, and work from there. Additionally, we've been working with the ACMG CNV classification group. They initially had, suggested terminology in their 2011 paper that then got formalized in ACMG 2015, and then they were able to use those in the 2020 guideline and move to a point-based approach, and now we'll move to a points-based approach. And then after we're put out the next version of point approach, we hope to have the CNV and sequence variant side come together and use the same point approach so that there's consistency between, when we're talking about points, it's one set of points and not different if it's CNV versus sequence variants. And since the 2015 guideline had come out, the SVI has been working on different updates to a lot of the ACMG criteria, and this information has helped inform a lot of the changes we'll be making for version 4.0, revisiting a lot of the questions that come up with VSEPs about, how to modify, this type of evidence and when is it appropriate to move up versus down. And so kind of the recommendations we've been working on within the SVI has helped inform what we'll be doing within the ACMG work group now. So some of the limitations, that had come out from the 2015 guideline is that there was a lot of subjectivity in applying different evidence criteria, and a lack of clarity around when can you combine certain criteria versus double counting, because the 2015 guidelines sort of just gave you this grid and said, take whichever evidence is appropriate, and it wasn't in a workflow kind of way of like, if you're doing this, then you can also do this, and if you're doing this, don't do this. Type of logic built in. And so we're trying to build some of that in with the next version, so there is more of a bit more logic and sort of decision based. If you're going down this path, here are the codes you could use. Additionally, we're hoping to get better guidance about when pathogenic and benign criteria are applied, which will help with us moving to a point-based system. So overall, I'll just go this briefly. Kind of our goals again to address the ambiguities that have come from prior versions. Look at the recommendations that came out of SVI, and consider moving to a quantitative framework, which we'll be doing. So overall, we're sticking with the same scope from the 2015 guideline. These are quotes from the 2015 one, that this is for a variant in a gene that has a definitive role in a monogenic disorder. The approach for classifying a variant is independent of the testing platform. So whether it be single gene, panels, exome, genome, you could use this approach. And to reiterate the point that the variant classification or pathogenicity is independent of interpreting the cause of disease in a patient. For example, often this comes up with carrier testing that, you might have a pathogenic variant in a person, but because they don't have another variant in trans, it doesn't explain their disease, that pathogenicity is different than saying, is this what's causing disease in the person being tested? So as far as how we got to where we are right now, and we'll go into all the math here, but many of you probably have seen from the work that Sean Tivatijan had led about moving the 2015 guideline to a Bayesian framework. He had looked at the different combining rules in the 2015 guideline, and then looked at what is the definition of pathogenic, 99%, likely pathogenic, 90%, and was able to work backwards to see, can you use a Bayesian approach that would determine sort of a framework that would fit with what was in Richards et al. And be able to see an odds for these different evidence levels. So the output of that, again, was kind of, if you look at the spectrum of benign to pathogenic and the different thresholds here, was able to look at what are the odds for these different criteria from the 2015 guideline. And this kind of helps from just sometimes even from a gut feeling approach of like, okay, if something's a supporting piece of evidence, 2 out of 3 times when I apply this piece of evidence, the variant should end up being pathogenic. And so it can help with some of the calibration. But this was a very math-heavy, rigorous approach. And so in a subsequent updated paper, we were able to use a point-based adaptation of this that still fits with the overall Bayesian framework. So instead of just having to say, 99% the chance of causing disease for a pathogenic variant, we could define it as having at least 10 points using the point system here, which goes to each respective evidence strength level from the 2015 guideline. And this also helps with, again, with the conflicting evidence. If you have pathogenic and benign, being able to move to this point approach allows you to sum across all the different pieces of evidence that could be available. So this overall system is our starting point for the next version. We're going to use these same point aliquots here and definitions for the different classification levels. And as we sort of look at the 2015 guideline and move them into the next version, a lot of the evidence types we are trying to sort of start around the same level they would be in the 2015 guideline, with a supporting piece of evidence starting at 1 point, moderates 2 points. And so this also will kind of help as people transition to the next version, having these point equivalents that if you look at a variant you classified with the 2015 guideline and think of, okay, so strong was 4 points, a moderate was 2 points, and sum those up, you'd be able to sort of see where you fall within the spectrum, which will then fit with the upcoming version of the guidelines. Additionally, by moving towards this point approach, we're also going to encourage laboratories or VSEPs to be able to start subdividing VUS into these different categories. Because uncertain significance ranges from 10% to 90% probability of causing disease. That's a really big spectrum that not all VUSs are created equal. And so we are going to be suggesting that labs could be subcategorizing their VUS into these 3 different buckets to better call out when is a VUS more likely over time to move up to likely pathogenic versus likely benign, and be able to give better recommendations here. We're not saying that this is a terminology labs need to use on reports or anything like that. We're more asking labs to at least be able to start tracking this so we can get more information about kind of the spectrum of VUSs and reclassifications of these within the different tiers. So overall, again, the next version will be point-based. We'll be using this kind of the point equivalents as the starting point. It won't always be an exact match. Part of the reason is, there are, if you look at the 2015 guideline, there's only certain point levels available. There's nothing that's 3 points because that would be between moderate and strong. And so not everything will be an exact match, but at least this will kind of help with a beginning version as we start getting used to the upcoming version. Additionally, the next guideline will not use the same evidence codes that are in the 2015 guideline. And this is because we want to be able to make it obvious when a variant was classified with the old guidelines versus the new. And if we reused all the same codes, it wouldn't be obvious, which version is being used for that variant. Here's just my caveat that what I'm showing next is all draft, that things are still in flux and changing. But as far how we're kind of overall structuring the different groups of evidence is right now we have them separated into 3 different evidence categories: population data, clinical evidence, and then molecular impact. And then within each one of these, sort of bigger buckets are different subcategory types. So like under clinical evidence, CLN, there's segregation data, de novo data here with DNV, and then the different codes for different molecular variant type impacts. And so what will be different compared to the 2015 guideline is that these codes themselves don't convey a direction like pathogenic or benign, or the relative weight or strength, that comes from adding points to these codes. For example, like right now, when we just say PPS1, we think, okay, that's pathogenic, very strong, as opposed to thinking of what is this actual type of evidence. And so we wanted codes that were more obvious about what is the type of evidence doing, what is this type of evidence, but that also doesn't have a inherent weight to it, that the weight comes from adding the points. So for example, a de novo occurrence, make it 4 points, which would be the equivalent of a strong right now, will be annotated with the CLN DNV +4 to show, it's contributing to pathogenic 4 points. Population frequency, maybe the allele frequency is high enough, you want to give it -3 points. So that would be here, the pop for -3. And then we are developing different decision trees, which I'll show in a moment, just an example of one that will help guide the curators to figure out what is the applicable point value to give this line of evidence. And overall, we're also kind of moving the codes towards having them be a little more obvious for what is the type of evidence you're using, as opposed to, again, kind of the generic codes that don't have meaning themselves in the 2015 guideline, but also not restricting usage based off variant types. For example, if you had a missense variant, but all the evidence about that variant is supporting that it has a splicing impact, it may be more appropriate to apply this SPL for splicing as opposed to missense, because it's causing disease by altered splicing as opposed to the protein change. So just for an example of kind of what one of these decision trees would look like, here's a decision tree for a nonsense variant. I should have added here, this comes with the caveat that loss of function is the mechanism of disease before you would get to this part. You can see it is more decision tree focused on, first is, NMD predicted to occur, and then going down different arms, looking at, information about this exon, if it is undergoing NMD, are there other variants in this exon that's not undergoing NMD, looking at what you know about this region, or again, other variants in this region. But in the end, you can see there are the different codes. We have, if you're going down the NMD path, the code would be NMD for unsense-mediated decay. Whereas if it's not undergoing NMD, we're using just CDS for coding sequence alteration and points here. And again, we feel like this was preferable to having a code called LOF because, what if it is a variant that is a nonsense that isn't undergoing NMD and is right at the very end of the protein? To put a code that says loss of function on that variant when it really isn't having a loss of function impact didn't seem right. So that's why we decided, again, to have the codes be more descriptive and about actually the type of evidence that you're looking at. So overall, what does this change that we're doing mean for BSEPs and labs? So similar to the 2015 guideline, we are making these, again, broad and meant to be applicable across a wide set of genes and diseases. So there still will be that component of needing to know information about your gene in order to apply the codes correctly. So for example, and Alicia on the call had helped put these together here just to sort of show kind of how things fit now versus in the future. Like right now when a BSEP is considering a lot of the case level data types, like found and affecteds, de novo, segregation, they're thinking through, okay, what is the phenotype I'm looking at? To count something as a segregation, is there a minimum amount of phenotype information I need? Is there also, sort of a classic phenotype that gives more weight versus more of a minimum phenotype? Or to get benign weight, what counts as healthy? What things do I need to look at? That, all these sort of map to our current codes, but the same information will be necessary in the next version to answer the questions about, case counts. How much weight is a specific case going to be able to get? What does it mean to be affected? What is needed to say, that this affected relative, should count towards segregation data? Is how specific is the phenotype? So the same information, even though it's going to be coded different, that's still the same process would be there for BSEPs of having to think through these questions. Same for, variant type, molecular mechanism. We've done some work on calibrating the missense predictors, but, a BSEP and still in a gene-specific manner, we need to look at how do these tools actually perform for my gene of interest. Is, if missense isn't the, the variant type that causes disease for this gene, is it even applicable to be using the computational scores? Or for, PVS1 currently, the loss of function mechanism, for the variants that aren't causing NMD or maybe like an in-frame deletion or end at the gene, BSEPs look at what are the parts of the gene that are important. Maybe it's not undergoing NMD, but the last exon is critical. That those same questions will come into the next version of, again, information about what are the regions of the gene that if you delete this, it's not going to cause NMD, but more of a literal loss of function that, this protein isn't going to be able to work. So again, just to show that the same concepts will be there in the next version. So anything that, BSEPs are working on right now will not be in vain, that these gene-specific components will still be necessary even with the next version of the guidelines. And then, just kind of overall timeline, we are hoping to complete a draft version by the fall and then have laboratories kind of start testing it out to be able to get some feedback. Once that's done, we'll be submitting it to ACMG molecular lab QA. It then goes through the board, it then goes out for member comment, and then we have to address those, and it goes back through all those committees. So this is just to say that even once we turn it into ACMG to start this process, it will take 6 months, more likely closer to a year, to go through the whole ACMG process. And we are not at that point even yet. So it is still probably a year away before the guidance would actually be official and out. And once it's out, we definitely don't anticipate that overnight laboratories or BSEPs will suddenly start using the next version, the day after it comes out. That, we understand that there will be a time period where, people will probably still be using the older version as they start adapting the new one and moving over to, see how their current specifications would work under a future version. So just say again that we don't expect an immediate adoption of the next version once they're coming out, that there will definitely be some wiggle room there. And then lastly, if we already have a big list of liaisons or people who wanted to pilot, but if you think someone from your lab has not reached out to want to be on this list, feel free to email. I can add you to the list for piloting in the future. And then just again for the summer workshop on this Friday, which I'll have a lot more information about the guidelines there.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. That was really helpful. So recognizing that this will be talked about in depth on Friday, I will open it up for brief questions just because we have a lot of things to talk through as far as other questions. But does anyone have any questions for Stephen briefly? Okay. Let's move on then to our Q&A section. And I'm going to say that as each variant small group member or proxy member presents an answer to their question, if you could just briefly introduce yourself, that would be great. I think that will save us maybe the most time.
Hi, we have just a question, if possible.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Yes, maybe we've missed that, but are there any points or weight if the variant is present in ClinVar as pathogenic or likely pathogenic, or not with the new system?
Yeah, so we are at that sort of that PP5, PP6 concepts will not be there in the next version because we already have recommended labs not use those. There still would be the option to use the data from that data that you see in ClinVar, or being able to use the cases or the evidence that's described, but not simply based off the fact that someone else has called it pathogenic. That there wouldn't be an option to adding that as weight in the next version.
There will be an option to add it, right? Or
no,
not?
There wouldn't be weight for just seeing that variant as pathogenic in ClinVar. No.
Oh, really? I mean, I don't know because what if not all the variants that are non-pathogenic are published. In a known gene, people don't publish the variants again. And a lot of these well-renowned labs that do diagnostics identify a lot of genes, a lot of them de novo, a lot of them, and they label them likely pathogenic or pathogenic. We could find variants that I've seen 5-6 times in ClinVar. So we should just ignore these?
I would use the evidence to look at the evidence summaries the laboratories are submitting to ClinVar, but I wouldn't, just because someone's calling it pathogenic, use that as evidence in my assessment. I would use the evidence that comes from those submitters.
Okay, but these are not published. These variants are not published in papers, so the evidence that they're just submitted to ClinVar is accepted?
If you're able to pull out that information, yeah. Like if someone's describing a de novo case they've seen, or it was found in someone with disease, that information you could then use in your own assessment.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay, let's move on to some of our questions that were asked ahead of time. I'm going to refresh this just in case. Okay, so we'll start with a general question, and this one is mine. So the question that we were provided is, let me move my Zoom bar so I can see it. Sometimes papers do not provide cDNA nomenclature of her variant and only give the amino acid change. How should we use or not this evidence, since the same amino acid change can have multiple cDNA causes? If the cDNA change is unknown, can we use this evidence? So while the ClinGen allele registry does allow you to search using fuzzy queries, generating C dots when you only have P dots, for example, so when you have this partial information, this is really more so encouraged for gene curation than variant curation. So we would encourage you, if you run into this in a paper, to try to contact the author and determine the cDNA change, as this can really become important when you have multiple variants with the same protein consequence. So when you're starting to evaluate PM5 or PS1, it can be really helpful to know the exact variant that you're talking about. If the author is unresponsive, you might be able to find this information in case level databases such as LOVD, because the authors may often submit their case level data into LOVIT and attach it to their publication. So to give you an example on the next slide, here is the LOVD3 for ACTA1, one of the VSEPs that I work with. And this screenshot here shows you sorry, I had to stick it in multiple screenshots because it's very long. But the variant is up here. You've got the genomic coordinates here. You've got the cDNA change here, the p-dot, and the publication here. So you can try searching in Lovid and looking for the publication to kind of come up with the cDNA nomenclature if the author, for example, wouldn't get back to you or respond. Okay, so at this point in time, I am going to pass it over, I think, to Alicia.
Excellent. And so I know Marina had said at the start that we would take general questions between each section, but I think seeing that we started off with general, that maybe we can hold general questions until the very end. I'm just going to change my camera, which has weirdly jumped. Now I'm very close, but so we received a few questions around the point system and the Bayesian adaptation of the Richards guidelines. And so group some of these questions together, the first two being, have we moved to the point system yet? Which is a question we get all the time. And then how does the point system work? So how can we adapt the current code system to the Bayesian point system? So firstly, in ClinGen, I can't speak to what clinical labs are doing. You're each going to have your own guidelines, your internal SOPs that are validated for what you're doing there. But our VSEPs, if they want to, can choose to adopt the points-based adaptation of Richards when they're defining their specifications. We're in the process of coming up with better ways to support this in the CSpec editor and CSpec registry. At the moment, it does default to the combining rules of the Richards guidelines, but we're able to overwrite them at the moment, and we're hoping to shortly move to a system where there's the option for you to check, I'm using the Richards combining rules or I'm using the point system, and it will auto-populate how it's meant to look. But essentially, if you're part of a VSEP who's currently specifying or refining already approved specifications and you want to start using the point-based system, knowing that that's where the whole field is about to move to, you are able to do that. And essentially how it's defined, so there was two main papers that were considered. So the initial paper that adapted the framework to a Bayesian model in 2018, and then using that model actually transformed it to a point system. And so each of the evidence strengths, supporting, moderate, strong, very strong, are then assigned a point value, which I have on the next slide, we'll go to in a second. And then those point values are combined to come to a final classification, and that final number is what corresponds to your classification category. And so as Stephen was explaining, it actually makes it a much simpler process of combining both pathogenic and benign evidence, because instead of coming to something that, oh, I have codes on the benign side and codes on the pathogenic side, what do? You have numerical values that you're able to add or subtract and come to what is the consensus number. If you have 8 points of pathogenic evidence and -2 points of benign evidence, you're still at 6 points overall, and it's a likely path, whereas in the current system, you're at a BUS. So on the next slide is how these point values correspond. So it is a wonderfully simple system. I actually find it much easier to remember than the Richards system. So supporting is 1 point for pathogenic or -1 for benign, 2 for moderate, 4 for strong, and 8 for very strong. And then, as I was saying, the thresholds for each of the different classifications. So pathogenic is if you're at greater than 10 points, likely path between 6 and 9, uncertain of 0 to 5, likely benign. How it's specified at the moment and what we're asking VSEPs to follow is -1 to -6, and benign is -7. This is actually going to change in the new version of the standards, which Stephen just explained, because at the moment, and this is how it was written in Richards, the thresholds were actually not symmetrical around that uncertain category. So pathogenic was 99% as a posterior probability, but benign was 0.01%, not 1%. So it was unsymmetrical there, but that is reflective of what is in Richards. So that's what we're using currently. Until the new guidelines are published, this is what we're using. And then I think that was all there. So next question we got, and then caveat in answering this question, I am not a statistician, so I am not going to get deeply into the maths of how the Bayesian adaptation works or what this means. And I assume most people on this call also don't want me to go deep into the maths. Whoever the person who answered this question was, or if there's anyone else on the call who has more of a maths brain than I do and really wants to dig into this, we can definitely connect you with the right people to have that conversation. But for today, what I wanted to talk about is what this means practically for the Bayesian adaptation. Like, how is it applied? So the way that I like to think about it, and what the original adaptation in 2018 did, is that it took the framework as it was defined in Richards, applied it to a Bayesian model. And one of the key points there was that the idea that if no criteria are met, so you don't have anything to support pathogenicity, you don't have to have anything to support benignity, you have nothing. That variant is a variant of uncertain significance for variants that are in disease genes. So if you were to think about any variant, genome-wide, any random variant, the actual likelihood of that variant's pathogen is that it's likely benign. If you look at all the millions of variants in Nomad, most of them are benign changes that aren't causing any impact to people. So most variants in any random gene, genome-wide, are going to be likely benign. But for the purpose of the framework, where what we're doing is we are assessing variants in genes that are known to be related to a disease. They have a gene-disease relationship that's at least got moderate supporting evidence. And so our prior for is this variant going to be pathogenic is no longer that it's a likely benign variant, where actually we don't know what this variant does, is our starting point. So the whole model was based around a variant with no evidence falling into this uncertain significance category of 0 to 5 points. And so the prior probability was set at 0.1. And then this prior probability number, and Marina, if you go to the next slide, was then used in this equation where we can calculate the posterior probability of pathogenicity. So these are our classifications that we end up with. So benign, likely benign, pathogenic, likely path, variant of uncertain significance. And so this incorporates that prior probability number, and also this element that was termed odds of pathogenicity, which are the evidence strengths that were defined in the Richards paper. And in the first piece of work that Sean did in 2018, he was able to come up with numerical values for those odds of pathogenicity or evidence strength, which is what we just spoke about, and incorporating into this paper. The question here was, is odds path an odds ratio or a positive likelihood ratio? I would like to double check on this, but I am fairly certain odds path isn't an odds ratio. It's just plain old odds. Like, there's no ratio in there. It's not considering two things. It's just the odds. And so I think that means it's a likelihood ratio. But I should get back on that. But I think the main point, I think this is a very maths heavy question, and that the main thing that most people should take away from this is how this is actually applied. And it's essentially saying that when we're considering a variant in a disease gene, our prior for this is that it's a variant of uncertain significance, it's at 0 points. And each time we're adding evidence, it's changing our posterior. And the final part of this question was, can we provide a calculator to look up what the sort of conversion is between posterior probabilities and evidence strength? There is a tool to calculate this that's given in the 2018 Tativian paper. And then it is something that we're considering generating as a sort of quick, easy lookup table, not applicable for every potential scenario, but as a quick lookup to develop that as part of the new standards. But that's obviously a future development item. I think that was all there.
Great. Thanks, Alicia. Thank you for tackling some of those difficult questions. So before I open it up to questions about Bayes or the points-based system, Megan, thanks to Megan Frone for rightly bringing up that although we do support that expert panels can move to a point-based system, Alicia kind of alluded to, our systems aren't necessarily 100% built or limber in our development resources to support that. So one big example of that is the CSpec editor doesn't have that right now, although it's a work in progress. And then another big thing is the variant curation interface is designed to have the Richards combining criteria right now, not the point-based criteria, which most of the time we can adapt appropriately, but there is no benign moderate strength in the Richards criteria. And so that is a little bit of an ill-fitting shoe in the variant curation interface at this time, and a little bit confusing for VSEPs to use. So thank you for specifying further that transparency, because that is how it is at the moment.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that. I had that as a point I wanted to make, that like while this concept is supported conceptually, in actual fact, like you can't use that -2 or -8 concept unless you're applying it to an existing code that you're moderating the strength of. And then again, as Marina said, like our systems don't actually allow for that to come. We're hoping in CSpec at least sooner rather than later that will be a field that you can create. But I would say probably the VCI development is now just going to be focused around the VCI for the new guideline. Like it doesn't make sense to invest a lot of development time into something that's about to be obsolete. So yeah, you do have to come up with creative workarounds to be able to implement the point system, but you are able to use it if you're willing to deal with some of those caveats.
Great. I'll briefly open it up. Does anyone have any questions related to the point-based system or Bayes? Feel free to stick things in the chat as we go to, and Alicia can take a look at them. Okay, we're going to move on to questions about in silico predictors. Justyne.
So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Justyne Ross. I'm one of the senior biocurators in the ClinGen curation core at UNC, and work on several different variant curation panels, as well as serving as a VCI proxy. So first today, I'm going to talk to you about in silico predictors. I'm going to try and give some brief answers to these questions and also direct you to some resources where you can dig in deeper. So the first question was how to find out if a variant was used in a training data set, if functional evidence was used for that variant, hotspot data, protein domain data, conservation data, population data, et cetera. So the short answer is really depends on what in silico predictor you're interested in, and there's not really a quick and easy way to do this. You can consult the original publications for each predictor, but may need to contact the authors for further information. And I've provided some references here for some of the predictors that are regularly used. Next slide. And just one thing to consider, though, is that if you use the recommendations from the recent publication from Pejovar et al. On the calibration of computational tools for missense variant pathogenicity for the PP3, BP4 criteria, variants were in training sets were removed from the analysis. So this may alleviate the concern of variants being in training sets when you're using the thresholds proposed in this publication, which I've shown on the next slide. Oh, or not. There it is. Yeah, so yeah, if you're using these thresholds that have been generally recommended, then these have already removed those training sets. Of course, if you're trying to replicate this to further refine for your specific gene, then again, you're going to have to go back and dig through those papers and contact those authors. So the next question on in silico predictors was looking for advice on in silico predictors for in-frame deletions and insertions now that the web interface for Provian is no longer available. So while the web interface for Provian is no longer available, the software is available for download. So that's one option if you're able to download and run that yourself. There are some alternatives as well. So there have these are at least 4 in silico predictors that will provide predictions on indels, SIFT-indel, DDIG-in, CAD, and VEST4 that all have web interfaces. And there's also some additional alternatives, again, available for download, BaseDel and meta-RNN. And I've included two publications here, one on VEST4 and one on meta-RNN, which did some nice analysis and comparison of these tools, specifically for predictions on indel variants. So those are some options. Do we want to take questions on those before proceeding to the next section?
Why don't we just do in silicos and splicing together, and then we'll take questions, I think.
That sounds good. Okay, so this next section is on non-coding and splicing questions. So we had two similar questions here. Was what criteria can be used for 5' UTR promoter and for 3' UTR variants? And also, is BP4, BP7 applicable? As for non-coding, like what should we check? Current suggestions are really mostly focused on splicing. So here I wanted to direct everyone to the Ellingford et al. Publication from 2022, where they addressed this topic in recommendations for clinical interpretation of variants found in non-coding regions. So on the next slide, you can see this adapted version of the figure from Richards et al., where they have indicated kind of which rules can be used for non-coding variants. So those in black are ones that can be used without any additional considerations. So, population data, segregation, de novo, allelic, phenotypic information. These are all things that can be used just as normal. And then those in the different colors are ones that maybe require some additional consideration for non-coding variants. So you can look in this paper to dig into any of these specific criteria more. But going back to the question on the next slide, specifically about BP4 and BP7, they do not recommend BP4 in the criteria that they suggest using for UTR variants. And so BP7, to remind everyone, is for a synonymous or silent variant for which splicing prediction algorithms predict no impact to the splice consensus sequence or the creation of a new splice site, and the nucleotide is not highly conserved. So this is really focuses on splicing as the potential mechanism that where a synonymous variant could in fact be having an impact on the protein product, whereas a UTR variant could have a splicing impact, but a lot of times if there is a functional consequence, there are other molecular mechanisms such as modification of RNA secondary structure, modulation of reading frame recognition by the translation machinery, and altered interaction with microRNAs and RNA binding proteins. So ruling out a splicing defect may not be enough for benign evidence for a UTR variant. You can, however, consider BP4. And again, looking back at this Ellingford et al. Paper from 2022, they suggest consulting the Rojano et al. Paper from 2019, where they give regulatory variants from detection to predicting impact for guidance on which prediction tools include non-coding variants. So I've included a portion of the table 3 from that 2019 publication here, which provides some predictors that do provide predictions for non-coding variants, including UTRs. So the next question is on splicing and how to better assess non-canonical splice variants in the ±3 to ±10 range. And here I have noted that this topic is addressed in the ACMG article from Walker et al. From this year, entitled Using the ACMG AMP Framework to Capture Evidence Related to Predicted and Observed Impact on Splicing. Recommendations from the ClinGen SVI splicing subgroup. And so they provide some guidance for applying codes for variants in the standard splice region designated for donor and acceptor splice sites. And they define this as the last 3 bases of the exon and 6 nucleotides of intronic sequence adjacent to the exon, and the first base of the exon and 20 nucleotides upstream from the exon boundary, respectively. So the work from this paper was discussed more extensively on the April 12th call when Logan Walker presented, and you can see the recording for that on the YouTube channel as well. So on the next slide, I've kind of expanded the region of interest we're talking about here to include that full splice region. But as far as how to assess these types of variants and the guidance from that paper, there are kind of 2 avenues. The first is the predicted impact. And for the predicted impact, you'll follow this flowchart where you consider if a splicing tool prediction predicts an impact, and the recommended tool was Splice AI. And I've shown the kind of the cutoffs here of using greater than or equal to 0.2 to apply PP3, less than or equal to 0.1 for BP4, and in between would apply neither criteria. If you do reach the PP3 threshold, then you can also consider the use of PS1 if there is another variant in this splice region that has the same or similar predicted impact. On the flip side, when using BP4, you would only use BP4, not add the BP7. So BP7 is considered for variants further intronic outside of this splice region. And now we can go to the next slide. And so then the other avenue you want to consider is the experimentally observed impact. So this is data coming from splicing assays, or assays demonstrating a variant leads to aberrant splicing profile. And again, I recommend you consult the paper where they kind of discuss different factors to consider when determining if it's an appropriate assay to consider. But once you've identified that assay, then you want to follow, again, this flowchart where you look to see if you have a variant-specific impact observed. If there's no specific impact observed, then you can follow this pathway for silent or intronic variants, which in this case does include the splice region. And you can apply BP7 at the strong level under the like RNA category. And you can also consider this in conjunction with the prediction criteria as well. So you can use both BP7 strong as well as the appropriate PP3 or BP4. On the pathogenic side, if the variant specific impact is found, then you can take whatever that impact is and follow just the normal PVS1 flowchart that you would use if you were looking at a canonical plus or minus 1 or 2 splice site, where you determine your strength of PVS1 based on if it's creating an in-frame or out-of-frame deletion, if it leads to nonsense mediated decay, etc. So you determine that strength from your normal PVS1 flowchart, and then consider what proportion of alternative transcripts are being produced by the variant allele and adjust your strength accordingly to reach your final PVS1 RNA criteria strength. And in this case, it's recommended that you use only the experimentally observed impact if you're using the PVS1 criteria, and you would not add to that the predicted impact. I believe that is my last slide.
Great, thanks so much for tackling those, Justyne. So I will open it up now. Does anyone have any questions on in silico predictors or non-coding variants or splicing? Feel free to unmute or stick it in the chat. Okay, let's move on to tricky variants, which I think some of those already were tricky variants, but more tricky variants. And if you think of something, just stick it in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to start with duplications. So question that we had was, how do you deal with large duplications? They often don't have defined breakpoints or are shown to be in tandem. If the same duplication, for example, the same exons, has been shown in tandem before in the literature, but not in the variant you are curating, given to you as unknown breakpoints, how do you reconcile this information? So in general, let's talk about duplications. So the ACMG AMP guidelines, the Richards guidelines, should really only be used to classify intragenic duplications. So one exon through to the full gene in size. And this is clarified in the PVS1 flowchart from Abutayuna et al. 2018. If you have a duplication that spans multiple genes, you should refer to the CNV guidelines from Riggs et al. In 2020, which are working on being updated now. But it's a bit of a similar flowchart to PVS1, but I've included the publication here. However, let's talk about the one exon through to a full gene in size duplications. So the flowchart is right up here. And so you have to have one exon to the whole gene, and you start to answer the questions of either proven in tandem, presumed in tandem, proven not in tandem. And then asking the question, is the reading frame disrupted and nonsense-mediated decay predicted to occur? You don't know the impact on the reading frame or nonsense-mediated decay, or the reading frame is presumed disrupted and NMD is predicted to occur. So with either not applicables for some of the unknown impacts on the reading frame, or proven not in tandem because you just don't know what it's doing if it's not right next to itself. Or PVS1 at a full strength if the reading frame is disrupted and nonsense-mediated decay is predicted to occur while it's in tandem, proven, or PVS1 strong. So caveats for this include your VSEP should specify that loss of function is a mechanism of disease if the duplication is predicted to disrupt your gene. Because as many of us know, a duplication could disrupt your gene, it could cause loss of function. Or if you have an entire gene duplication, it might be triplosensitivity that is your mechanism of disease. So if you have an entire gene duplication, triplosensitivity should be specified as a mechanism of disease for your gene. This curation should be done within your VSEP ahead of time for your specifications. And the ClinGen dosage sensitivity map can help in this analysis, as many of the genes have been curated for that. And so this is one example here for LMNB1, where they have given a dosage sensitivity score of 3 for sufficient evidence for triplo sensitivity. Consult with the experts of your VSEP. But if the same or a similar duplication has been published in the literature, this could likely be counted for cases and also used to follow the PVS1 flowchart to PVS1 or PVS1 strong, particularly if that one has been proven to be in tandem, because VSEPs aren't working on specific clinical cases. They're really often working with conflicting variants in ClinVar or variants that are published in the literature. However, if you are working on a case from an array or a clinical case from a genome, you really should consult your clinical lab if you have that clinical case and you aren't sure about the breakpoints, or you aren't sure about the possibility of it being in tandem or not in tandem. So I will turn it over to you, Jenny, for start codon variants.
Yep, thanks, Marina. Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jenny Goldstein. I'm a senior biocurator at UNC in the ClinGen biocuration core there. Thinking about start codon variants, of course, these are variants that are altering the A, T, or G of the start methionine codon. And so the question was, how do we better classify variants in the start codon? So there are a couple of things to think about here. The first are the VSEP's specifications, which I'll go over, and then there's going to be a nice example from Pamela. I don't know if we're going to have time to go over that today, though. So let's just start with the VSEP specifications. So initial guidance on specifying for a particular gene, PVS1, came from the Abutayuna guidance that came out from the SVI in 2018, and the PMID is there in the bottom left. And of course, anytime you're using PVS1, you have to ensure that the mechanism of disease is loss of function. So this guidance was fairly conservative, but as you can see here, there were several things that the SVI asked us to think about. The first are there multiple transcripts for this gene? So could there be a different functional transcript that uses an alternative start codon? And if that is the case, then you should not be using PVS1 for start codon variants. The next thing to think about is, where is the next in-frame ATG? And if that were to be used, how much of the protein is lost, and are there critical domains that are lost? Also some evidence that can indicate that that area of the protein is important, that area of the N-terminus, is whether you're seeing other pathogenic variants in there, and in particular, pathogenic non-loss of function variants, because if you imagine things like frame shift and nonsense, they're just going to presumably result in nonsense-mediated decay. So particularly if there are non-loss of function variants upstream of the next frame ATG. Those are things to think about. So in those initial guidance, the SVI suggested using PVS1 at supporting if there are no known alternative start codons in other transcripts and no pathogenic variants upstream of the closest potential in-frame start codon. However, if there are pathogenic variants upstream of the closest potential in-frame start codon, you could apply PVS1 at moderate. So going on to the next slide, please. And I'll just go quickly. So I did look at a few different specifications for PVS1 for initiator or start codon variants from the CSpec. Of course, this is a fabulous source. Hopefully, you've all been into the CSpec and you can see other people's specifications for groups that have been approved. So these are just a few examples. But again, these groups have looked at what is the next in-frame ATG codon, and what area of the protein would be lost, or how much the N-terminus is lost, and what is in that N-terminus. For example, for LB2, HNF1 alpha, both of these groups have specified PVS1 at very strong, because so much of the protein is lost and there are critical domains in there, and there are also clinically relevant variants upstream of that start codon. A couple of other groups, these are metabolic diseases, so GAA, which is causing a lysosomal disorder, and ACAD-VL, mitochondrial protein. In these cases, if you were to use the upstream or the downstream rather ATG, you would lose a leader sequence, which is critical to getting that protein where it needs to go. I think both of these groups were a little conservative and just applied at strong. And then just completely going off the SVI's guidance, HNF4A for monogenic diabetes, they had shown that there were pathogenic variants upstream of the next start ATG, but for GCK, they just used it at supporting because there was only one VUS, no pathogenic or likely path variants, and only one VUS initial codon variant. So that's a very quick review of just a few of the specifications. And then the next step was going to be a nice example of this from Pamela, but we can maybe cover that another time.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I didn't realize we had only 2 minutes left. I was keeping such track of the time and then forced you to answer a difficult question in 2 minutes, but you did a great job. So we knew that we had a lot of material to cover, so I want to thank everyone who put that together for this, but we are slated to continue this discussion in October. So don't worry, we'll have some more time for questions and for some of the answers that we have in this slide deck. So I wanted to thank everyone who presented today because we're after the hour, and everyone who attended, and we will see you next time for the Gene Curation Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Marina. Thanks.